contribution, Colin. And seeing as how we're 5 minutes into the talk, it seems like an appropriate time to slowly introduce our esteemed speaker while we wait perhaps for a few more people to filter in, but we'll start getting going. So like I said, welcome earlier, for those who weren't there, welcome to the penultimate event of this year's Winter 2021 speaker series for the STandD. And it's been a real fun kind of couple of months, and I'm very happy for you all to be here today. A talk I've been excited about, in part because I'm a fan of the speaker, but also because this is going to be a pretty interesting sort of somewhat methodologically inclined talk that kind of draws from an area both geographically and also thematically that we haven't necessarily touched upon a lot in STandD talks this year. So I think it'll be a great contribution to the series overall. So we have Elise Imray Papineau presenting. She's a PhD candidate at Griffith University in Queensland, Australia. Her doctoral research will situate DIY, which is do-it-yourself, and gender dynamics amid the cultures and praxes of grassroots activists in Australia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. She completed her MSc in anthropology at the University of Montreal, having researched Muslim punk in Indonesia. Elise is herself an organizer and participant in the grassroots activist scene in Brisbane, and spends her free time printing political handmade shirts for a side project entitled Punks for the Planet. I had the pleasure of meeting, the good fortune of meeting Elise in 2017 as we were both helping out with the CASCA IUAES joint intercongress at the time. And that was a very fortuitous turn of events because I was able to then for a few years, entertain dialogue with Elise and be colleagues in various things. And I can report that she was the co-founder of Anthropologie Montréal, which is an organization that is still surviving, that really kind of aims to foster dialogue and fun between graduate students in anthropology at different universities in Montreal. And I can say as the other co-founder that she was really the brains and the drive behind the project. And last but not least, she was also the former lead singer of the musical act Far-Fetched. So without any further ado, I'd like to present Elise, and the stage is yours.
Wow, thank you for that introduction, covering all the bases, which I had not expected, but that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I hope there's not too much noise. I'm in my activist office at the moment, just a bit closer to the city, and there's a rally happening right after this, so, activist researcher dilemmas. Yeah, so let me know if the sound or anything is an issue, but it should be all right for now. Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in despite the challenges of time zones and occupying a part of your time on either a Friday evening or for a Saturday morning for myself. And thank you, Nick, for the opportunity to talk about this today. I think it's actually been quite an important exercise for myself in reflection. And I really hope that we can have some critical and constructive discussion at the end. So I'm sure a lot of you are going to relate, at least to some degree, to what I'll be talking about. And if not, it's an interesting departure point to think about what we qualify as safe and ethical research, and how conducting research can quite emotionally affect us as well. All right. And yeah, just before I start, I just want to begin by acknowledging that I am on the stolen lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people here in Mianjin, which is also called Brisbane. And I extend solidarity with those battling forms of white supremacy and colonial violence from here to Turtle Island. So in my presentation today, I'm just going to be using the first phases of my PhD project's data collection to kind of unpack the experience of working with grassroots activists, the precarity of navigating that kind of terrain, the challenges in designing a safe and ethical qualitative research methodology, and the implications of my own position as an insider researcher. So this is in the scope of obviously a PhD project, which is about situating DIY and gender dynamics in the activist cultures and practices across 3 countries of the Asia Pacific, so Australia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And I'm currently working on the data collection in Indonesia and the Philippines, obviously from a distance. So I won't be talking about those today, but I'll really just be talking more about what's been going on in the past couple months with the Australian side of the fieldwork. So who are grassroots activists, first and foremost? They are individuals who seek to undermine power from a bottom-up approach to achieve social or political change for a given cause or campaign. So in this sense, the resistance originates and grows from the roots. So the most basic level or fundamental starting point. So they don't usually receive funding from governments or from large organizations, and usually work from a very non-hierarchical, decentralized, horizontal structure. So this is what distinguishes them from other forms of like semi or formal activism, so lobbyists, NGOs, professional activists. And because they operate outside dominant structures and they even actively resist dominant structures, they end up navigating different realms of precarity and risk. Government authorities, mainstream media, and in some cases even researchers have contributed to the negative perceptions of grassroots activists by misrepresenting their intentions and perpetuating damaging stereotypes about their character. So often being labeled as extremists, as ferals, as pests, as hippies who abuse of the welfare system, and every other example that you can think of. I'm not there yet. So what is the importance of studying grassroots activism today? Well, despite the drawbacks that the pandemic has caused, 2020 saw a wide array of mass protests across the world, and these are both over more familiar grievances such as corruption and police brutality, but also about newfound causes of dissent related to the virus, so economic hardship and government mismanagement, to name a few. And as rising polarization in democratic and semi-democratic countries increases, so does the likelihood of political unrest and protests among citizens. So this stresses the critical importance of studying grassroots activists and the ways in which they perform resistance. It's also not to mention that there's been a pretty big run-on effect in 2020 from really influential countries like the US, obviously, with mass protests happening there, and how that's kind of had this spurred on protest effect in other countries, and even more complacent ones like Australia, where the biggest protest we had last year was the Black Lives Matter protest, which was inspired by what was going on in the States. So how do we actually take on fieldwork methodology with grassroots activists? I mean, that's pretty much a big part of the presentation today. My research as an anthropologist relies on rich human interactions. So through semi-structured interviews, participant observation, and the like. And so to better understand grassroots activist cultures and practices, it's crucial to open dialogue with these people and inquire into their daily activities, their stories of success, of hardship, their critical insights, and their perspectives. And that not only allows to validate and legitimize their lived experiences, but also to document, of course, the cultures and practices that they utilize in their struggle for social change. But obviously, it's not as easy given the precarity that they exist within. And then how does the pandemic affect all of this? Well, of course, the health risk of traveling has forced me to shift my methodology quite a bit. Of course, Australia has been hit a lot less hard than a lot of other countries, so I'm still able to do fieldwork on the ground within Australia for the most part. And the challenges of switching to online ethnography are not something that I'm really going to explore that much in the scope of this presentation, but definitely merit to be discussed, since I'm sure it's affecting pretty much everyone who's doing research in the field at the moment. So when I began designing my research project, I felt really confident that grassroots activists would want to participate in the research, first and foremost because they're proud of what they do, so they would be eager to share, that they believe that the legitimization or the platforming of their narratives and experiences through academia would have positive outcomes for themselves or their community. And lastly, that they would be willing to engage with me because I am myself a grassroots activist. But in so doing, I failed to contemplate, at least at the beginning of the project design, some of the barriers that could deter participation, including the wide array of legal, political, social, and economic risks that grassroots activists would face if their identity was disclosed or if security culture was breached. A big one, which is the cultural clash between grassroots activist values and the more neoliberal corporate structure of academia, and the lack of direct benefit to participants versus the cost of what their time and other personal resources would be, especially during a pandemic. So this left me with some new questions to contend with, and most of these came to the fore during the course of a 5-month negotiation / battle with my university's ethics committee. So some of the new questions that emerged were, what additional measures can I implement to mitigate the potential risks to my participants and ensure that the project design doesn't compromise their trust and safety, nor the interests of the activist collective? How can I reconcile the clashes between academia as an institution and grassroots activist values? And how am I going to negotiate my insider status and my personal commitment to the activist struggle while also carrying out the responsibilities of a researcher? And I'll save you the suspense. I have not found the answer to these questions, or at least I have not fully resolved these matters. But of course, for a lot of us in the field of anthropology or related fields, there's rarely an easy or a static answer to questions like these. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about grassroots activists and the context of the precarity that they kind of exist within. Personally, I knew very little about grassroots activism before I moved to Australia, but after settling here, I very quickly became extremely active and involved in primarily climate justice and animal rights activism, and then last year in refugee rights, and then doing some solidarity work in between with First Nation struggles. So some of this is anecdotal, from what I've experienced firsthand. Some of it is what I've witnessed as an activist, and some of it's what I've documented as a researcher. So grassroots activists can face hindrances ranging from social stigma to legal persecution, and this precarity is bound in material conditions and power dynamics. The grassroots activist experience is not only shaped by particular spatial and temporal context, but also deeply linked with identity politics, class, and hegemonic attitudes and othering. In 2021 in Australia, the experience of being harassed by bystanders, threatened online, or being arrested can be upsetting for any activist, but it will likely be more dangerous or traumatic when experienced by an Indigenous person, a transgender person, a survivor of domestic violence, someone with acute anxiety, to name a few examples. The same is true anywhere, of course, but there are further complexities in countries such as Indonesia and the Philippines, my other field sites, given religiously informed social norms and greater concern about the state's power to censor and punish dissidents, and little accountability about the way in which it yields that power, especially in the Philippines at the moment. So grassroots activists perform important acts of resistance for a given cause or community, but their defiance is not without risk. So consequences that they can face include social stigmatization, emotional burnout, alienation, online or offline harassment, physical and verbal abuse, loss of employment, arrest, fines, jail time, criminal convictions, deportation, and in the most extreme cases, death. It's not really within the scope of this project to talk about why they exist in these precarious contexts, but rather I'm interested in why we haven't developed proper guidelines about how to do safer research with these individuals, or at least not so far that I have found in my vast literature review. So again, looking a bit closer within the lens of Australia, grassroots activists here are generally speaking in a less dangerous position than their counterparts in Southeast Asia, because they benefit from the perceived freedoms that a Western government offers and the protections of a fair legal system. Despite this, there is still a lot of police brutality against protesters and so-called political agitators across Australia, and the victims of this violent repression are often marginalized individuals. Indigenous Australians are particularly susceptible to racist profiling, mistreatment, and violence. Since the end of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody in 1991, more than 400 Indigenous Australians have died in custody. And actually, right after this presentation, there is a rally just down in the city here, which is commemorating 30 years of that Royal Commission. So in 2020 alone, I personally witnessed dozens of incidents of police brutality during nonviolent demonstrations by grassroots activists in Queensland, and countless others have been documented on film and released into the public. So activists from a lot of different groups, and this again is ranging from climate action, animal rights, refugee rights, we have Indigenous struggles all across the board, have either been assaulted by members of law enforcement themselves during peaceful protests, or have been personally targeted in other ways, such as having their homes raided. Police are known to use intimidation tactics to incite activists to comply with orders, and these can be particularly traumatizing for women, people of color, queer, non-binary, and transgender persons, individuals with PTSD, acute anxiety, etc. And while it's morally questionable, it's actually not illegal for the police to lie, to use compliance measures, and to wear people down through dehumanizing acts like strip searching, which could lead someone to incriminate themselves or their activist peers. Court systems in Australia, similarly to those in the UK or North America, don't operate in favor of grassroots activists. Apart from the emotional distress that can accompany the experience of arrest, grassroots activists also usually leave the courtroom with hefty fines, ranging anywhere from a few $100s to a few $1,000s. Recurring offenders will eventually end up with criminal convictions, and that can end up in jail time. But this isn't a very common occurrence among the grassroots activist scene, at least here in Brisbane. So all that taken into consideration, how does one practically undertake ethnographic fieldwork in the activist space without further risking the safety or well-being of potentially vulnerable individuals? So the first issue is that ethnography requires observation, but most activists actually actively try to evade forms of observation and surveillance in their everyday practice. A key convention in activist spaces is to engage in security culture. And that's a set of measures that individuals of a group will collectively implement to reduce the risk of leaking sensitive information, of incriminating people in their group, of jeopardizing the success of an action, and being infiltrated. So basically try to remain as unknown, unseen, unheard as possible, especially by authorities. That also means staying unknown to people that you just don't know or don't trust. The central tenet of security culture is that people should never be privy to any sensitive information that they don't need to know. So essentially everything is on a need to know basis. And as a researcher, I don't know if I can justify the fact that I need to know this information. So all activists should be taking precautions and considering potential risks to their safety and well-being when sharing information, whether that's online or in person. Both humans and forms of technology can easily listen in on sensitive conversations if they aren't recognized by activists and appropriately dealt with. As Bradish notes, we increasingly find ourselves in a surveillance ecology. So this begs the question, how do we conduct observation of activists without breaching their security culture? Hinton Milan, in their article about conducting research with cyber activists, talk about social science being a police science. Other authors have brought this up, pointing out that social science research can also be used to legitimize the antagonists of a movement and could contribute to the stereotyping and even the criminalization in some cases of a movement. So good intentions just aren't enough. Good security culture would also posit that activists just don't discuss anything potentially sensitive around someone who's not a trusted member of their collective. And even if you are a trusted member of the collective, you would still need to go to extreme lengths to make sure you respect their boundaries in all of these ways, and in collecting that research, disseminating it, storing it. So anyone who's being observed should be entitled with full transparency to the aims and the scope of the project, the information the researcher would be recording, how it will be handled in the following stages of the project, and who will have access to it. So of course, this all kind of comes back to informed consent. Anyone involved in the collection of data should be given opportunities to read through the research findings before they are published. This is especially important to ensure that if any sensitive details haven't been picked up by the researcher, that they can be omitted before publication. Should there be any doubt about this, the safety and well-being of the participants must be made a priority over academic engagements. If we can't respect our participants enough to value their welfare over our self-interested achievements, then we probably shouldn't be conducting qualitative research with these persons and risk compromising them in the process. So during fieldwork in the city of Brisbane, I would announce before the start of a meeting if I wish to take observational notes, or take a few moments to explain the project, hand out information sheets if anyone wanted them. I'd clarify exactly what type of information that I would be recording. And if there was any objection, I would just not take any notes at all. But typically I received collective enthusiasm from people. So it helped to kind of build up my trust with people as a researcher and not just as an activist, so kind of switching hats in the same space. And this was crucial to my praxis as an activist researcher, not only because it's respecting the group security culture, but it also aligns with my personal understanding of security culture, which extends to respecting individual boundaries and vulnerabilities, being vigilant of subtle coercion tactics, protecting confidentiality of others who are maybe not present, and maintaining transparency about my own goals and my own stance in this. So it was expected that my project would discover illegal activity, even though it doesn't really seek to intentionally find out this information and expose it. In Brisbane, the majority of my participants were involved in varied forms of protest and resistance, including the practice of nonviolent direct action, which is NVDA, and civil disobedience. So some forms of NVDA are considered illegal, but the extent will vary in different cities and different states. But this could even include sitting on a sidewalk where you don't have permission to sit, and then this could be considered illegal activity. And then the ethics board is very strict about all of this. So because a lot of my participants are involved in this type of activity, it would come up in conversation. And again, these could be things that seemed a bit banal or not extremely serious or dangerous, but the fact merely that they are considered illegal kind of raises some questions in how to handle the situation. So it does reinforce the importance of protecting the participants' anonymity. So whether the experiences are something public or private, there's still always a risk of incrimination. So none of my participants chose to discuss actions or events that were still in the planning phases, and that was strongly discouraged to do so, just because the public disclosure of any important details like the time or location of an action could have jeopardized its success and its safety. And that's also because our phones are tapped. Spaces like this activist office are being monitored by the cops. And so it's really, really easy to have this information leaked if we aren't using correct platforms or if we aren't using security culture practices. And again, during tech-free action planning meetings to plan things that were more disruptive. It was also really interesting to be able to be a part of that and to take notes, but notes had to be extremely generalized because again, any mishandling of physical notes could again risk the upcoming action or incriminate people involved. So notes were extremely generic, but still conveyed a sense of organizing. So talking about how many people had shown up to a meeting, where they were, how the facilitation is run in a horizontal fashion, how they were going from making a plan, going back to another plan, then going back to the other plan after doing some scouts in the city, after reviewing the effectiveness of their first proposal versus their second proposal, but not actually writing down any details about who was in the meeting, what location they were aiming to disrupt potentially, at what time, at what day. All these things could potentially be used against them. Unlikely, but potentially. Just quickly mention this case study because I found it really interesting to look at in regards to my own research. So this is a documentary made by a woman in Tasmania. And in the documentary, she recounts how her role as a filmmaker actually led, at least in part, to a group of 20 activists, including herself, to being sued for millions of dollars by a major forestry enterprise. This is because despite her best intentions, she was filming the community and the activists on the front lines to kind of give them exposure and give exposure to the cause they were fighting for. but her footage was actually used as evidence to identify the various activists that were involved and to legally incriminate them. So her visibility as a filmmaker accrued attention, which was negative in this sense, but I guess also positive for the cause overall in a sense. But it really increased the stakes for the people involved because it subjected them to higher levels of surveillance and varying degrees of financial and emotional burden throughout the process and the court case especially. So although she was not a researcher and didn't have to undergo, for example, the same bureaucratic hurdles with an ethics application, for example, it still attests to the importance of ethical considerations and safer project designs for any work involving grassroots activists, especially those who are on the front lines, like the ones here. And so let us also not forget in that process that whether you're an academic or a filmmaker or a writer, a journalist, that documenting grassroots activism can also risk inflicting a substantial emotional burden on the person themselves, the documenter. So in her film, Douglas discusses the deep distress and anguish that she felt when she realized the gravity of the situation and the role that she had actually played in it. She even mentions feeling suicidal from the emotional and financial stress of the court case. So researchers who work closely with grassroots activists should be prepared in a sense to face the same potential legal, social, economic, and political repercussions as their participants. They could also be targeted by authorities or the state for their association with a given group, which could lead to a number of personal, professional, and financial consequences. So, and I'm going to return to that point later. So a thought that came to me during my ethics battle is that some activists are more vulnerable than others, and some will have very few potential risks involved if their identity, for example, is disclosed, while others may be in potentially very dangerous positions or face more severe legal and political ramifications should their identity be disclosed. And because I can't guarantee that this project will have no negative impacts or repercussions at any point, how can I preemptively identify the risk level of these participants? So I suggested to the ethics board to alleviate some of their concerns that I would create a risk management protocol in the participant recruitment. And I have never done this before. I don't know how to make risk management protocols. So I'm just going to be frank about that. So this is something that I've completely tried to learn over the past 8 months. And it's something that I've reformulated over and over. But yeah, I do want to bring that up as I make a bit of an assessment of my own protocol here. So the point was to ask participants before agreeing to an interview to fill out this short questionnaire. And it was meant to help identify if potential participants had already previously been targeted by groups or individuals for their involvement in activism, or to what extent their safety would be jeopardized if the information that they disclosed was made public. So it is a bit of a novel contribution to the field of social movement studies, because again, I found no existing guidelines on how to manage risk in participant recruitment or further in the kind of project design. So I think it is an important contribution for qualitative research projects working with vulnerable political agitators like grassroots activists. But I also have some critiques, which I want to unpack here a little bit. So in theory, anyone who would score in like a high risk category would be suggested to not participate in the study. But in practice, I found that the results of the risk assessment questionnaire actually didn't allow me to make clear judgment calls about an individual's risk level. For example, 2 of my participants in Brisbane scored between a moderate to high risk after filling out the questionnaire. And I discussed it with them personally, explained in more detail what the interview would be about, which is again, not about illegal activity, but about DIY and the experience of being a woman in grassroots activism and the impacts of COVID and so forth. And I brought up the potential risks again and explained that in regards to the score that they had from the risk assessment. And they both said that they still definitely wanted to participate. So in that case, I felt like I had done my due diligence in ensuring with full transparency that they were informed, that they had the opportunity to reflect about that and reassess the benefits and the risks. But I'm still not sure if this is enough. So you may be able to see here, I know it's a bit small, but these were the questions that I initially used for the Australian risk assessment version. Yeah, to be noted that it's different in Indonesia and the Philippines. So I'm quite mindful while I was using it, but mostly afterwards, that the questionnaire is fairly flawed on one hand because it assumes that people filling it out are aware of the risks that their activism entails. So for example, question 2 supposes that an individual knows if they are at risk of facing personal consequences if information about them is disclosed. And most people responded unsure to this, which doesn't give me any indication of the risk level. Questions 3 and 4 are a bit problematic because many individuals probably don't know the extent of which they're being monitored, surveilled by government, or how easy it is for their personal details to be accessed online, whether they try to keep a low profile or not. And then my thought process with questions 5 and 6 relates to security culture praxes. But I think that I actually I went off on a bit of a weird tangent here. I expected that an individual who takes security culture really seriously and doesn't often experience security culture breaches would be lower risk because it means that they understand the importance of keeping sensitive details secret and would be less likely to incriminate themselves or others during an interview. But this is completely arbitrary because someone may be less concerned about security culture if they work with organizations or with groups that do completely public and legal actions. So that individual might actually be lower risk, but not give as much care for security culture. So due to the lack of context, these questions are a lot less effective at measuring individual risk level than I was originally hoping. So it might be more about the types of activity they're involved in rather than, for example, their knowledge of security culture. But then that gets into a lot of the nitty-gritty of the interview. And I'm not trying to record this data for the interview. However, it could also be argued that the mere existence of this added step in the consent procedure could prompt individuals to think more seriously about the benefits and risks, as it forces them to kind of reflect in answering these questions about their involvement. So whether it's actually really successful in mitigating risk or it's more of a bit of a performative tool that I've implemented, I'm not 100% sure. It was one of the key measures that I implemented to meet standards for ethical research conduct, but I recognize that its capacity to actually gauge risk is fairly limited. This is why I don't usually use surveys or tools like this ever. So perhaps if I had thought of incorporating this from the get-go of my research design, I could have maybe consulted with more relevant actors to develop the questions a bit better and to maybe adapt the threshold for scoring before I pass it through the ethics board. But it was very much a reactive solution that came out of nowhere. So I think it is, again, beneficial to have, but I think it definitely merits some refinement in the actual questions. And so again, yeah, although this point of reflection has allowed me to modify and I believe improve the risk assessment questionnaires for Indonesia and the Philippines, which I think is actually where the risk assessment is a lot more important than in the Australian context. And just before concluding, I want to talk about the implications of being an insider in the context of this research project. So I think it's really important for researchers to critically evaluate their own position before, during, and after fieldwork, because it will shape, obviously, the methodological design of the project, but also impact data analysis. So as someone who actively participates in grassroots activism here, I've considered at length how my insider status has both helped and hindered me in my pursuit of critical analysis. There's no clear dichotomy between the position of insider and outsider while conducting research, since it is likely to shift during the process based on interactions with other actors and the ever-changing dynamics of in the field. So of course, I have much greater familiarity with the cultures and practices of grassroots activism in Australia than I do in Indonesia and the Philippines, since I have the firsthand experience here. But overall, I think that my insider status afforded by my background in activism has been really beneficial to the research. But at the same time, it's injected a lot more emotion, bias, and concern into my investigation and my interpretation of phenomena. So rather than being a researcher going native, I follow Hodkinson's idea of being an insider going academic, which has placed me in a fairly good position to develop rapport with participants and to critically evaluate their experiences. Insider researchers, as he calls them, have a more privileged access to knowledge because they have additional resources available to them. As such, this may grant greater access to participants and relevant spaces for observation, which is of course an asset in conducting fieldwork. Furthermore, insider researchers have the lived experience, affiliations, and understanding to more effectively unpack the complex contents of qualitative research data. On the flip side, insider researchers also run the risk of becoming so entrenched in the experience of fieldwork that they assume the role of subcultural spokesperson. In so doing, they may find themselves speaking on behalf of others rather than allowing them to speak for themselves. Bennett also warns that the familiarity shared between a researcher and their participants could lead them to confess more personal information at a faster pace, due to an establishment of common ground that resembles mutual trust. And as such, it could be a way to cut corners with the ethical process or with informed consent. So it turns out that boundaries are really important, and I'm really bad at boundaries. So this was especially difficult to navigate in Brisbane because my research goals align with a greater pursuit of social justice. And I do really believe that the greatest way or the most effective way to bring about social change is to demand it through forms of community organizing and direct action. So though my pedagogic training in anthropology has taught me to strive for neutrality and typically avoid forms of interference, I really don't believe that ethnographers can be reduced to passive observers. The delver I deep into leftist spaces and grassroots activism, the harder it is to maintain a detached and impartial stance from the people with whom I interact, be they my peers, my potential research participants. And I think this is completely normal and justified, but I also see that it can pose risks to the research itself and to myself. So when I began my fieldwork here, I had the ambition to compartmentalize my activist intentions and my research obligations. So I had two physical journals. I had one that had my activist notes, which was for activism, and the other that had my research notes, which was for research. Obviously, that didn't really work. And I also included entries about my personal thoughts, my challenges, recorded audio memos, which included a range of all three of personal thoughts, activist notes, and research notes. Also tried to discuss the frustrations and the challenges of fieldwork with, close friends, but most of my friends are activists, and I didn't want to jeopardize or bias their perceptions of the work I was doing. So the biggest hurdle that I faced during fieldwork was an error of my own judgment. So upon beginning data collection, I really believed that I could be a full-time researcher and a full-time activist, and I was sorely mistaken. So while trying to strike a balance between those two things, I was weakening my ability to do either of them. So I experienced a rather interesting dual burnout from both the activist and the academic realms at once, which resulted in fatigue, irritation, heightened level of stress, anxiety, waves of intense self-doubt, and even resentment towards my colleagues, my peers, my activist peers, my friends, and the movement that I was a part of. My activist peers noticed it first, and my close colleagues noticed it soon after. So to illustrate what I was doing during data collection, I would go into my campus office and work there for about 5 hours. And then I would bike from my campus office to this office, and then work here for another about 5 hours, have more meetings, plan things for actions, plan events, organize people, try to keep this is a community-owned space, which means collective responsibility, which means if you're here and it's a mess, it ends up being your mess, which is great. So try to keep this house office in order, which was a huge investment of time. Some days were shorter, some days were longer. Weekends, unfortunately, were no respite. Weekends are a better time for actions and events, so weekends were often busier. And so this just meant like an all-around, just like running on adrenaline all the time. So it became really hard to kind of back away, especially because of my commitment to both of those roles, but also because it was part of the participant observation, it was part of the interviews, and it was part of my everyday praxis. So it came hard to say no. I had committed to some organizing roles. I didn't feel like I could offload them. Also had pretty intense imposter syndrome over the fact that if I stopped doing activism, I wasn't a good enough activist, or if I cut back on my research, I'm not a good enough researcher. So of course, it did actually give me a lot of insight to be a full-time organizer during this time. But it was also a workload that I sorely underestimated. And the consequences of my burnout were mostly inflicted on myself. But the fatigue and the mental frenzy during that time also led me to make some just irresponsible mistakes. For example, at one action where 2 of my friends were being arrested, and there was a huge police presence, I had my activist notebook with me in my bag, which was just an oversight. It's not something that you do. You never bring physical notes with maps and ideas and people's names. It should never really leave a comfortable or safe spot. And I had it with me around tons of police. And this was especially imprudent because I was on bail at the time for a previous protest-related charge. And I could have been arrested simply for breaking bail by being at around this protest action and being affiliated with them. So little oversights like those, which don't seem necessarily like that big of a deal, but I really kicked myself for it afterwards for the risk that I could have been putting other people in. And so I did eventually force myself to take a step back. And that was after fulfilling a pretty large action here in Brisbane that I spent about 6 weeks planning. And after kind of taking a step back, I did come to realize that the interviews had been really helpful in streamlining my personal understanding of Brisbane activism beyond my own personal bubble. Speaking with a lot of individuals I normally wouldn't interact with because they aren't active within the campaign that I work primarily on. So really helped me gain a new outlook on the dynamics of grassroots activism in my own city, provided some new opportunities for collaboration in the future. Also gave me a bit of an insight on some of the key gatekeepers in other campaigns or movements that I had not yet met, which was great. And a lot of my participants brought up some key themes that I hadn't thought of, especially to do with, different age groups. So it was a very interesting position to be in, and I don't regret it. But the burnout wasn't super fun, really. And upon further reflection, even beyond this, the experience of burnout has really reminded me of all those emotional tensions that can surface when engaging in deep ethnography. So these tensions, albeit very legitimate, are never really discussed or mentioned in the process of obtaining ethics clearance or of research method like project design. At least not as I have experienced, but maybe someone has a different experience. So I was instructed, for example, by the ethics committee to change my methodology due to health and safety risks caused by the pandemic, but there's never any advisories about mental health or emotional burnout. So those intimate and visceral conflicts that arise from deep ethnography, when you're profoundly committed to the project that you work on, these are often overlooked by the university. There's very little pedagogical attention to the causes and effects of imposter syndrome, in the academic realm, and that can have a substantial impacts on a researcher's emotional well-being. I've actually found out that 20% of university students suffer from imposter syndrome, and it's estimated that number is a lot higher in post-grad circles. So with odds like that, universities really need to take seriously the short and long-term consequences of imposter syndrome, which can range from, perfectionist and workaholic tendencies, which will manifest during that time and later in life, to acute anxiety and depression. So in my case, the experience of conducting fieldwork with people that I deeply respect really contributed to my own imposter syndrome. I was constantly confronted with the self-doubts about my capacities as an activist, which fueled my sense of obligation to invest more time and energy into activist responsibilities. In addition, I felt the need to continually prove through my actions that I wasn't just a self-interested researcher, especially since those anti-establishment and anti-research attitudes do exist within many grassroots activist communities. So that nagging, consistent feeling that you might be burdening your participants or acting against their wishes or misrepresenting their voices in your work, that can be incredibly debilitating and isolating. And that's an often neglected reality in scientific research. And perhaps because it doesn't fit the scope of any official consultation or clearance processes and safe and ethical research design. But then at which step of the project should these matters be considered? Surely it's not as helpful if our approach continues to be reactive rather than proactive. So to conclude, I hope this presentation today helped maybe to explore some methodological concerns regarding safe and ethical conduct of qualitative research with grassroots activists, and maybe extending to other political actors or vulnerable individuals. Despite the various risks and situations of precarity that grassroots activists navigate in their everyday lives, there's been very little inquiry into this topic, which has led me to explore this in such depth. So drawing on my experience, I've tried to unpack the logistical and ideological issues around security, surveillance, sensitive information. I'm still wondering how to create a more effective risk management protocol beyond the one that I initially used for my own research design, and still thinking about the considerations of my positionality as an insider researcher, which is going to require, thorough self-reflection and accountability throughout all stages of the project. So as the spotlight on protest and activism increases, it is important that scholars of social movements and cultural sociology and anthropology more broadly platform the voices of activists without subjecting them to greater vulnerability and prejudice. So I strongly encourage scholars of this field and others to contribute to ethics-based and methodology-centered discussions in order to develop more effective and safer research practices for our participants. And again, this was a really important step for me to take in my broader project, to take this time to think about the methodology, the benefits, or what's been successful, what's been less successful, before throwing myself into the next steps of my data collection, which are with individuals who are definitely in a lot more risk than those that I have worked with so far. So really trying to take it as seriously as possible, but still unsure as to how to do this in the best way. And so my contact, but I don't know if Nick, if you have a specific chair method with this, but I do have some questions that I'm happy to answer questions, of course, but I also would like to pose some questions to those who are here and gain a little more insight on what you believe in regards to these topics, and just hear a little more, maybe engage in some kind of critical discussion on that. And yes, that's all. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Elise. And thanks for politely giving me the choice of how to proceed. But generally, my method is however the presenter wants to go, let's go. And so, yeah, thanks for being proactive and quite organized in your question period preparation. So, I mean, the floor is still yours. And then we'll open up to questions afterwards, discussion. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, but floor is yours. well, I guess, do you want to like lead the discussion, or do you want us to ponder
Well,
for a while of these?
Well, I'm wondering if sorry, I should try to find the chat thing. I'm wondering if is it more, if I'm happy, if are there like questions related to things first that I should answer that anyone has, or would people, are people in a space to contribute their own insight and answer some of these questions?
Yeah, well, let's
or
find
other
out.
things.
Colin has his hand raised. Colin, the floor is yours.
Unmute here. Okay. Thank you. A fascinating set of issues. And I guess I have a question which relates to the context, the different contexts of your research, and maybe how, what ethics board perceptions might be of these different contexts. And it's shaped to some extent, or what I'm wondering about is shaped to some extent by the work of a number of us with partners involved in CICADA, in the Center for Indigenous Conservation and Development Alternatives. And we work with a number of Indigenous partners globally, a few of whom have had killings on their territories of activists, of people who have protested mining companies or, forestry extraction, one thing and another. And my sense is that their perspective on safety and security is almost the inverse of the perspective on safety and security in a liberal democracy like Canada or Australia. That is, anonymity is extraordinarily important in mass protests or large group protests, where there's a potential for being sued, where there's a potential for being picked up by sophisticated, but perhaps above all, where there are certain safeties and securities built into the justice system. So, you can be criminalized, but the worst outcome is a long way short of death or even long-term incarceration in most cases. You're more likely to be sued for $2 million than you are to go to jail for 2 years. That's such a different context from, I would imagine, places like Indonesia, the Philippines. And the sort of perspective we get from many Indigenous partners in the South, in the global South, is the more public this is, the safer I am. Like they want, in many cases, they want the maximum spotlight on them so that it's harder for them to be disappeared or killed. And so that's a very different logic. It's a very different context of real danger from the kinds of dangers faced typically in Canada. And I don't really know how well equipped ethics boards are generally for dealing with those distinctions. And so I guess my curiosity is what actually has been the bottom line from the ethics board at your current university. Your risk assessment, as you've said, turns out to be, fall short of your own hopes and expectations for it. But what is the ethics board willing to, if it's something kind of less precise and quantitative than an actual score, what kinds of processes of judgment or You know, rules of thumb, do they actually expect of you? Going into situations which in reality, in any place, in any country, fast evolving, unpredictable, so context sensitive that it's very difficult, it seems to me, to anticipate in an accurate fashion.
Yeah, it definitely, the first time that I got feedback on my ethics application, I had to do a full review because there was this, the clause was, will your project potentially discover illegal activity? And of course, I had to say yes, because forms of protest are considered illegal. But of course, this is not really the same sense that we shared on what is illegal activity. But they then came back to me saying that they wanted me to describe in detail what I would do if the authorities general, seized my data. What I would do in detail in that situation. And I honestly I have no idea how to respond to that, because I think, again, it would be so context specific on what country is this, which authorities, how did they get the data, and what data is this exactly, what kind of protections am I entitled to in that case? Like, I don't really know. And I discussed, whenever they came back with some questions like these and asking me to put together a set of I guess measures or plans. They wanted a lot of plans of what I plan to do if XYZ happened, because I would mention that, you know, there are certain risks, but they're very unlikely. But every time I mentioned a risk, they would say, well, what's going to happen? What exactly will you do when that happens? And I always kind of had to give a kind of tactfully vague response. My supervisors had never had to respond to questions like these, so they also weren't sure. And they had also never experienced an ethics negotiation being so long. They usually apparently isn't very long here. Most people can get away with a very, very quick 2 or 3 week application. So 5 months was kind of out of the ordinary. I think they did have some concerns, especially the Philippines was their big concern. And like it's also my biggest concern, because activists are murdered and disappear. And it is the second deadliest country globally for land defenders, environmental activists, and Indigenous activists. So it definitely is more of a concern. But as you said, with the visibility thing, I also have talked to some people who, you know, have very public profiles, are very proud of what they do, and they don't want to be shrouded in all this anonymity. They want to have a public profile, and they want to have that public voice. And that also leads me to an ethical question of, you know, when do I keep people's real names? When do I not? I said I wouldn't keep anyone's real names. I said that I wouldn't use anything to identify my participants for their own safety. But then I have some people, in Indonesia and the Philippines who, in a way, kind of want the platforming and want their names to be included publicly because, of course, I'm very proud of the work that they do and want their voices to be spread more loudly and to be affiliated with what they've talked about. So that's another concern that I'm not quite sure. I think the ethics board probably would tell me to not do that, but at the same time, like, I do kind of feel like that goes against the agency of my participants. I'm not sure if that completely answers the question, but that's kind of where it took me.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks, Elise. I, of course, have a lot of questions and also kind of talking points to the questions that you've asked, Elise. I'll just cycle through to see if there's any hands up. I guess, first of all, I'd like to thank you, of course, for your presentation, for things you've contributed. raising important methodological issues, ethical issues, but also, for honestly talking about your own experience of how this has affected you to some extent, and raising issues of burnout, and kind of things that go along with that. And I guess to answer the first question you prepared for us, I think I'm now recently going through the experience of coming to terms with burnout to some extent, entangled with research, and this, I'd say, I haven't been to the field coming on 3 years now for various reasons. Partly was ethics review board, not so much problems that they had with my application. And I think that part of how there wasn't so many problems with the application is because they only find problems with what I tell them, because they don't know the dangers as well as we might when we intimately know the field, or when we have a general idea about what we might interact. The delay seemed to have been just an administrative crack in the floor, but still, nonetheless, it kept me from the field. But all that to say, I think just as we're as anthropologists, as researchers, anyone who's really passionate about something that is their vocation, I think that so even though I haven't been to the field in nearly 3 years, it's part of me every day, and part of my thoughts. And even just not being in the field makes me feel to some extent like I'm letting folks down, And then of course comes the idea, well, they don't need me, or try to just a lot of ping ponging around in my head. But definitely encountered a burnout during studies research career. And yeah, I guess, I don't really know what to say about that, but how did I manage it? I don't know. Figuring it out as I go, but I can say that it's an interesting part of research that I guess we're not really groomed for necessarily in our methods courses and things of the sort. But I do think that I'm not, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it is what it is, at least for me. I think it, to some extent, is kind of synonymous with our care for what we do, and especially the people with whom we do it, both in the field and beyond. But so yeah, there's something good in there. I think at least it's certainly a care and really a drive to try to do the best we can. And to some extent, in terms of at least how when I'm in the field, because when I'm in the field, I don't really feel burnt out. I feel pretty great. But there's always these questions of, whether or not I'm doing a good enough job, or whether or not I'm a burden, sometimes mentally, but sometimes quite physically, as in without me, we wouldn't need that extra reindeer for my bags, and we wouldn't need to spend time tying it down and things of the sort. But I guess the one thing, and this doesn't necessarily help in all situations, but it's just kind of keeping the faith that with the good intentions and open heart, so what we're doing it's not perfect, but it's somewhere in the vicinity of the best that we can, and hopefully that's good. Of course, always remaining skeptical, but yeah, that's sort of from my end. But I also had some questions. Oh, well, one thing I'm just somewhat curious as you about kind of, I don't know if it's complete yet or not, but how you've adjusted the risk management protocol for Indonesia and the Philippines. If you have any kind of, start, if you have something ready, or if you're working towards that, but just kind of how you're adjusting. Yeah, and another thing is just, I found it interesting, you raised the issue of, thinking of opening up to your research participants, collaborators, however you want to call it, about your own kind of uncertainties concerning fieldwork, or just your own thought process kind of behind the scenes about how you're doing your research. and figuring out if that would be detrimental, if it would bring bias to the table. That's a really interesting, thing, and I often encounter that in the field myself of being, well, let's say I ask someone a question, how do you feel about the national park in the field? And often instead of an answer, I'll get a question. How do you feel about it? Well, what do? Do I just treat them as animals I'm studying and I'm not going to tell them what I think? So I find constantly, we are being researched, we are being studied as much as we are studying others. And I think I've been leaning towards being a bit more transparent or translucent with my participants. There are ethical concerns, or things I have to keep to myself, but generally, I think that's the track I've taken. I think it's been good for my relationships with people, but of course, perhaps less scientifically objective or anything like that. And I'm sure there are a lot of faults one could find with that. But I thought it's a very important kind of thing. And also, I find it's different, but somewhat related to kind of breaking down the fourth wall, or just actually admitting to the reader, if we are to write, or to the audience, kind of about our own thought processes going through that. It's really of a different order, but there's a certain reticence, perhaps to some extent, sometimes, about really going into the depth of it. So thanks for addressing those. But yeah, what about your risk management protocol?
Yeah, thank you for pulling me up on that. Yeah, so I have modified them, but not entirely. I've kept some of the questions and rephrased them a little bit. I've added a question about, I've removed some of the questions about security culture, or rephrased them. I still think it's interesting, but I just don't know how yet exactly I gauge it. But I've asked about if someone's activist involvement is public or not, and the extent to which it's public. So I think that does, like, as we just talked about before, someone who is extremely covert, who maybe just engages in, like covert actions, doesn't maybe uses like a fake profile like online and stuff, like you cannot find them. And I know a lot of people who do activism in that way. They do not want to be found out. And I think that it's because they engage in sometimes like more risky types of activity that could incriminate them. Whereas, yeah, again, some of the people who have like a really public profile and are like public advocates as well, and use the platform to further their cause or promote their cause and themselves, the information's already out there. Like things that they're probably going to talk to me about in a lot of cases are already online and public, available to the public. So I have less risk of, or less concern about someone intercepting, the interview or the information becoming public, since it's already public. But yeah, thinking there might be some more things to mitigate. The other thing is, even in doing the risk management, it doesn't necessarily give me an indication of whether or not I need to, not interview this person or interview the person. But it also allows me to adapt a little bit to like the actual interview process itself. So for example, with the interviews that I've been doing online, as most people feel really comfortable doing like a video conference thing on a secure encrypted platform, but some people might prefer to not have their face recorded. So like there's no recording of the face, just use audio. There's also an option to use like a voice changing software if they don't want their voice recorded for any reason. And there's also the option as well to just do it in writing. So using like, again, an encrypted application where I can send the questions and they send them back, so that nothing identifying them apart from, the more minimal risk of the actual information somewhere from point A to like point B where it needs to go being intercepted. So that's been changed. In the Philippines, I've even included a question it's very point blank. It's, have you been red tagged? And red tagging is the process by which the government is like further censoring activists. So red tagging is like associating them as communists, and there's still a very big moral panic about communists and the New People's Army. So if you red tag a group because they have leftist or progressive ideologies, or because they have anti-government critiques or whatnot. It also means you're on the list where you're much more at risk to go missing, to be attacked, to be harassed, to be killed. And so if I have people who've been red tagged, it's also like a bit of a flag for me to keep in mind, to maybe either adapt the interview, to remind the people of the risks involved. But also, to be extremely mindful of that, because someone who is red tagged is already under more surveillance and already in a more precarious position. If that helps. I've also included a question about if people experience other forms of discrimination, like due to their gender, their sexual orientation, their religion, their ethnicity and whatnot, because I think it's also important to factor in that their personal vulnerability may be linked in with other conventions in the given country where they're existing, and that might be part of their activist struggle, but it may also just be something to inform me about whether or not they're already being targeted just for their identity on a daily basis or not.
Mm-hmm. Thanks and good luck. Matthew, you have a question?
Yeah, so I just have like a pretty simple question, I guess. As someone who's like pretty naive or uneducated on grassroots activism, I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned the topic of civil disobedience, and I'm wondering, like, you gave the example of sitting on a curb where you're not allowed to sit, for example, and how occupying that space for a certain amount of time would then, incur some sort of risk. And you have this like spectrum of civil disobedience where there's like obviously like lower risks types of civil disobedience to higher risk. I'm wondering if that always intersects with something that would be considered like illegal activity, or if there's kind of a gray area where you engage in civil disobedience and you're not necessarily doing something illegal, but it's something that's like, maybe socially frowned upon, or something that's like, not illegal necessarily, but also something that's like discouraged from a social perspective.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of things that come to mind on this like spectrum. There's a lot of things that like grassroots activist communities will do that are just frowned upon because they're unconventional, but aren't actually illegal, or like on the border of legality, but like it's just a context thing. So like, for example, we have a lot of people since COVID started who have been engaging in guerrilla gardening as like food sovereignty projects. So they're taking pieces of land that are just not being used, but are technically like owned by someone, or they're owned by the council, and like digging them up and making gardens out of them. And the practice of doing that is technically illegal, but they're doing like community gardening or guerrilla gardening, in which the harvests go to like a space where you have meals cooked up for people who can't afford food, can't afford their own meals. So it's a really great mutual aid project, and it's great, but it's technically illegal, so people can get in trouble for that. Another example is like, we have an area in the city center that's like privately owned. It's like a mall, but it's like an outdoor mall, and it's illegal to protest or to use amplified sound, so like use a megaphone in that area, because it's basically just a corporate capitalist consumerist space. And so despite the fact that like you have a democratic right to protest, you're not allowed to do it there. And so if you go in there and you have a megaphone, or you like step on a little crate and you just start speaking, you'll get fined. And we have people who've been fined, like $660 for just like speaking for a few minutes there. That's other stuff. I mean, we've had people arrested for using chalk on the street, but they also use anything that they can if they're trying to target certain people. So they'll target organizers, people they've seen oftentimes And if they're using chalk on the sidewalk or on the road somewhere, they could twist it in a way that allows them to, take them away, arrest them, have them, keep them away for a few hours, which hopefully then demoralizes other people in the meantime. But then that's the strength of the horizontal organizing, is that there are no leaders, so you should be able to keep going. But it's really an interesting spectrum of things. There's so many things that we do that are not illegal or just on the border of legality, but that you can get in a lot of trouble for if they want to get you in trouble for them. And even just the representation of that, like being white in that space, usually you might get away with it better. But if you're a person of color, or you're, from a more marginalized community, like you're more likely to be arrested or to have a harsher penalty for doing these things. So it's pretty ridiculous. There's a lot of systemic and blatant racism in Australia. It's great.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks, Elise. And man, a $660 fine. They could have upped the ante $6 to make it $666, but I guess not. You can see if there's any other questions. I, of course, have more. So I guess I'll just go. One thing, and there's another little thing I have. It's not so much related to, well, it's related to what you've been talking about, but it's more of a peripheral one, perhaps, but more precisely related to what you were talking about earlier. You were speaking a bit about how, when you're writing notes, you try to have generalized notes so as to not be that identifiable, right? And that's, it's a somewhat of a common thing to think of pseudonyms and things like that, but in some instances, I imagine pseudonyms wouldn't necessarily be good enough kind of to be safe and cautious. So I guess I just wonder, but also knowing that being quite specific in our note taking and about the actual particularities of people, places, events, timeline, it helps at least me to really kind of, cue into more broad trends, but also very specific kind of particularities about one person or how they relate with others in the community. And eventually I learned a lot through that. And my analysis is largely due to particularities. I guess I wonder, how do you balance the kind of generalized aspect of things to keep things less identifiable, and your own kind of, your own scientific or analytical just attention to particularity and your memory of it. Yeah.
Great question, Nick. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. I don't really know yet. It's something that I'm still reflecting on. I think maybe an example of that is that because I'm not targeting in my participant recruitment, this is quite broad. I'm not looking at people from a specific activist group or cause. So I'm not just looking at, for example, like environmentalists. I'm looking at anyone who engages with grassroots activism or considers their engagement with activism to be grassroots. And so even there's going to be a lot of nuance because people have different conceptions of what grassroots is. But anyways, because I'm not limiting to just one type of or cause or movement in terms of activism, it's quite a broad spectrum. And that also means a lot of people are part of a lot of different groups and campaigns. And I still haven't decided whether or not I'm going to say who those groups are in the actual written up in my thesis and in publications. In some cases already, in some other conferences I've talked about, I've used examples of groups here in Brisbane to contrast and compare, and I use the names of the groups because they are public groups. But I don't know if, again, in the sense of keeping people anonymous and protecting their confidentiality, if even saying, this activist who is a part of and listing the name of the campaign or the name of the group, it's just another, it's a way to potentially identify, a pool of people. I don't know yet. Again, a lot of these groups are public, and have a public presence, have public platforms, and have like large enough, I suppose, like participation that you know, talking about the group. And again, my project is not about the illegal or the sensitive elements at all. So all of this stuff is like merely a precaution in case it comes up, but it's really not at all the focus of my project.
Yeah.
So again, talking about like what's more likely to happen is talking about how some groups incorporate DIY in theory and in praxis into their activist forms of resistance. Or talking about how some spaces are safe or unsafe for women or for people of color. So like assessing the accessibility or the inclusivity of grassroots spaces. Or talking about how people have found clever ways of continuing to be involved in activism despite pandemic restrictions. And so those things, again, aren't really to do with the really sensitive stuff. So I like, part of me again is like, it doesn't really want to give into that thing of just, removing these particularities. But I don't know yet. I think people would find it more enjoyable to read and to be able to see themselves more and be able to contrast and compare and get more out of it if they were able to see the names of groups and campaigns. Like, I think it would actually be more effective, but I don't know if it poses additional risk that would need to be considered. So maybe it'll be a mix of both. Not sure yet.
Mm-hmm. And that, to some extent, at this point, you're talking about your actual public-facing communications about your research. Yeah, I guess that's one aspect of my curiosity. The other is really just for yourself in your note-taking or things like that, because even like, for example, and so my context, you know, I mean, it's you know, Indigenous people living in a national park. They're, you know, the worst that can happen generally in terms of park-related crimes is usually just fines and hassle and, you know, emotional things that go with that, but generally not death, sometimes brief imprisonment. But in my outward facing work, so I'm very, and perhaps dangerously so, specific in the particularities of what I learn and from whom and when in my note taking. But in my outward facing communications, rarely will I actually say the name of anyone, which is also a bit of, you know, I want to bring particularities into, you know, with names and faces, but it's only with a select few sometimes who have really made it clear to me that they want to be named. And generally I'll just find a way of being less specific, and I find that okay, although it's probably not as effective as it could be in terms of an actual piece of literature or whatever. But yeah, but in your note taking, are you still like allowing yourself to attend to the particularities and to record them, or is that too dangerous to do when you're sometimes in situations where you could perhaps accidentally have a notebook on you and someone could, you know, remove it from you, and you don't have to say the answer to that. But I'm just curious because, and if not, it must be difficult, you know, or it's difficult regardless. But
yeah, I definitely don't use names because names are, it's even just, that's more from like activist security culture. Even sometimes in speaking, like if we're talking about an action that even happened like a long time ago, but there were some people who were helping to drop people off, and that were, you know, maybe they were masked and they didn't want to be identified, and we'll just say, oh yeah, old mate. That's the Australian way, but we're like, yeah, old mate. Everyone's old mate. There's no, you're like, you do not use names. And so it's the same thing in the writing, just in case. And it could even just be someone I don't know picks up or rifles through my notes, or someone else within, you know, who comes to this space, which is this is a pretty open activist space. So other people come and they rifle through my notes for some reason.
Yeah.
And they maybe have not bad intentions, but they end up telling their other friend about, you know, they just don't have as good a security culture practice, or, you know, they have a few drinks, like, oh, did you hear about that cool thing where those people got arrested? And then you know, this guy was involved and this person was involved, and this stuff happens, and there's no perfect way to do it, because of course, like, these things get out, and it can sometimes be linked with egos, like people being really, you know, really proud of what they've done and like wanting to boast a little bit about the fact that they were involved in that thing, and they'll kind of talk about it, or they'll kind of try to slyly hint at it, and then they end up, you know, divulging a bit too much information. And it's one thing if you just incriminate yourself, but it's another thing if you're incriminating others. But yeah, for that reason, I just, in the notes, there's no names. I will use the name of like the group, but again, that's public, so I don't think that's much of a risk. But yeah, I'll write down like demographics, like, you know, how many, like the spectrum of like genders and ages that are attending meetings, and maybe I'll say like the facilitator, or this coordinator, or like a woman in their 30s or whatever. But I usually know who I'm talking about. Yeah. To an extent, but yeah, the names thing is just really very, very highly discouraged. So I think I've kind of internalized that.
Yeah, fascinating. It's yeah, interesting to oh, we got a Matthew Vatican. I've got to run. Great presentation, Elise. That's from the chat board. Real interesting to be doing sort of clandestine research when research is an outward-facing, publicly funded, and like, you know, but both to do your research, you got to talk about it, and after you do research, you got to talk about it, and yet much of it is clandestine, and fascinating stuff. Speaking of chat, we have one, Malcolm wrote to everyone an interesting comment. I haven't read it in its entirety, but I'll read it out. It won't be a question for me, it'll still be me speaking, but even in highly technical quantitative discipline such as engineering, risk assessment is fraught with difficulty. The objective is to establish whether the outcomes of a proposed action or task constitute an acceptable or unacceptable risk. The difficulty is in the definition of the division between these two, and the danger is that if the outcome is undesirable, one can be tempted to rationalize the inputs to change the outcome of the assessment. It's still valuable because it forces those conducting or participating in the risk assessment to think about what the risks are and attempt to rank them and consider mitigations. Very true. And an interesting part, and I'll return to this, is in my experience, much of this risk assessment is done behind closed doors, and not, if you can, I mean, if I can afford it, it's not necessarily done with the review ethics board. You know, it's kind of give the ethics board just enough for them to chomp on the bit, ask me to do some stuff, I give it. But the actual real issues are thought of individually or with colleagues and friends, family, people, kind of behind closed doors. So it's interesting that it is quite a productive, like a generative process, but one that is fraught with danger, and if only just administrative hurdles that are quite challenging if we actually go fully into it with the appropriate actors to do it. Yeah. Yeah, so now, my other little question, I thought about this, I've been thinking about this recently, okay? And this is more peripheral to what you're saying, because it's not necessarily, I find that it's an ethical issue here, and it perhaps is indirectly related in some instances to the actual safety or lack thereof of people with whom we do our research, perhaps more in your case than mine, but that's somewhat debatable. This issue is that, so I've realized that when I do research, oftentimes, and especially on the internet, you know, oftentimes if I'm researching a phenomenon, well, I'll want to visit the web pages of different entities. So let's say if I am, and some of these entities are not necessarily entities that I would support myself. But in order to find out, you know, let's say like if there's a video I find online of a nature conservation initiative, well, who is behind this video? You know, what organization, what are the partner organizations, where's the money coming from, etc. What's the money used for? So I ended up going on so many different web pages, and more I realized that my actual click And my eyeballs scrolling the website is part of the metrics that allows for capital gains for those entities. And it's been really thinking about, so the more I want to learn to some extent about things, the more I am contributing to various entities' abilities to act. And sometimes those entities' actions have negative impacts on the people with whom I learn and work and love. So I wonder, if in your context, if sometimes you're looking up, various entities or things like that online where it could be potentially harmful, just your online presence, or in other ways, not necessarily your click contributing finances to another entity, but just perhaps you being traceable by someone who maybe is surveilling you or anything, but how that online presence can really have impacts that don't necessarily hit us in the face, as soon as we log on to the interweb.
Yeah, that's a good, I mean, I don't think I have any examples of like specifically clicking like a certain website or whatnot, but in a way, I mean, anything you do is going to contribute to your traceability. And there's no way to completely eliminate your traceability when you exist in like an online realm. And that is something that I've considered quite a bit as well, even just like myself navigating over the past little while. Like, do I want to have a public, be like a front facing or public facing as an activist and a researcher? Do I want to be very public with this? And obviously, like, I am at this stage because I don't really know how else to do it. For a while I had deleted my LinkedIn and all of my, cleared the Google search and all these things because I didn't want the target on my back. You already get enough harassment from people who are anti-climate change and anti-animal rights and whatever, misogynists and whatnot, who will harass you online, or and that's fine. But then you do eventually, the more you're involved with this stuff, a lot of people do end up being in a position where people are starting to send them threats, and then realer threats, and even maybe coming to their house and figuring out their contact information. And I have nothing of that sort has ever happened to me. I don't think that people really view me as a threat, but some activists obviously have a much greater impact and they're at that stage. So I even for a while had to consider the cost and benefit of like myself having a public profile. And then again, of myself having a public profile as a researcher and an activist, how that might potentially affect my participants. Again, if people are able to then more easily hack into, like, for example, into my email or into my social media or into some of the platforms that I use to communicate with my participants, am I putting them at more risk of them having their information then also intercepted or interfered with somehow? And I don't know how to manage that. I mean, in the ethics application, the solution to all of this was, I will only use encrypted platforms, which is also not possible because I also have some participants who do not want to use some of the encrypted platforms that I want to use or that I've been told to use. And then it's a matter of no interview or an interview on a non-encrypted platform. And through communication, a lot of people I've talked to in the first instance through email, and not a secure email, or through WhatsApp or through Facebook. So not secure platforms either. That's not when any sensitive information was disclosed, but from the get-go, you have an instance where there's been a point of communication, whether or not there ends up being an interview. So I told the ethics board that I would also get a research laptop, so a loan essentially from the university, which is completely clear of all of the perhaps more risky things that might be on my laptop. I mean, my personal laptop is secondhand. It's not great. It's definitely been monitored by who knows. And it's more at risk of basically interference than something else would be. So my personal laptop, I don't use for anything related to my research. unless it's through like, Facebook or my university email. But on my research laptop is where I do any like kind of interviews, data annotation, where I store things, and I don't open any other pages like social media pages or whatnot on that computer. But even then, I mean, that was kind of like an extra measure to perhaps heighten the online safety and the traceability, but it's obviously not foolproof at all. And because it's a Griffith University computer, it's linked in with my, my university credentials, which automatically, there's like a cloud and there's all of these other systems that link to my desktop computer, which is also, not the most safe. It's a, public computer in a grad student office. It's not ideal. So I really don't know to what extent it does contribute itself to the privacy of for my participants, and that's what I'm again most worried about. I don't really mind as much if I get backlash for it, but it's not being able to control potential repercussions for others, and that's the thing that I would have a really hard time contending with personally. So yeah, I'm still not sure how to navigate it. I also didn't really know much about any of this stuff before COVID happened. It's been such a learning curve of having to actually learn these things and learn about online security in conducting data collection online, because I never had to do that before. It's kind of one of those, darn, it'd be so much easier in the field, not really, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it does, and to some extent, and I say this not facetiously, but the I don't know and I'm figuring it out aspect, I think is very important, partly just because it's, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I know that for me, it's figuring it out as I go always, and kind of, I don't know how many more questions we have, but I do think that, and I want to thank you for this, that I do think that aside from all the interesting methodological aspects to research, and but I do think that you kind of are bringing together, and your research itself kind of brings together some important things that are occurring right now, whether or not you're doing research, whether or not you're a grassroots activist, which is a lot of, a whole world of online activity and surveillance online, and kind of correlated, like the actual perhaps political economy of online data harvesting, surveillance, etc., which is something that most of us, and many of us, and especially with the pandemic, how many things have gone virtual, just as this, perhaps we're even more online than we were before, and so we're more kind of subject to all that kind of the shadows of online activity, without really grasping, understanding really what we are treading in, what lies just beneath us in the water we're treading. And also another aspect that brings to the forefront is, well-being, mental health, which is, I think, very important for researchers as well as grassroots activists and just about everyone. Perhaps now more than ever, or if not now, in quite a particular way. So I think it's real important and it's quite interesting how your research, but also your way of talking about it, kind of brings all that together. So yeah, real interesting stuff. And what does that mean? I don't know, but thanks for bringing it up, for raising these issues.
Yeah, well, thank you for giving me the platform to do it.
Hey, my pleasure.
Yeah, if there's any other I don't know, questions, or like if anyone has experience with any of these things in terms of burnout, or like having to navigate something similar, like what you did, and if it worked or not.
Lead a nocturnal life? I don't know, it hasn't helped me so far. Yeah, I mean, I'll keep scanning. I can talk for hours, but I'll keep scanning a bit. it seems that I mean, people are, you know, attentive, but at the worst case, after I ramble, and if we figure out if this is really the end of the talk, then you can have a little bit of a few minutes earlier start for your event, rally, or protest. Yeah, or we can hang out and chat, anyone who wants to chat, but I keep circulating through. I see pensive faces, but so far no hands raised or anything like that. Yeah, I mean, it's done me some good to listen to this, and so I'm thankful for that. And but it's a fascinating time for it to be alive and to be a researcher, I think, to some extent, especially if your research is originally planned to, or still sticks to the plan to another country. And stresses, which is a rare opportunity, and I think as much as it can in some contexts itself be a setting for burnout or stresses, it's still at least it's still at least a great opportunity to do something you're passionate about, and you know that can sometimes help through burnout, or be the cause of burnout. But yeah.
I have to run now, but I really want to thank you for this presentation and the discussion, and I hope one of these days to read the thesis and or the book that follows.
Awesome. Thank you so much for, you know, sticking it out in Friday evening and the questions and everything.
Take care.
Thanks a lot, Colin, and thanks for the mountain lion story as well.
Thank you, Nick.
Pleasure. Cheers.
Good evening.
Where did that noise come from? Okay, sweet. Well, I mean, I think this is safe.
I just
Carol?
wanted to say
Yeah.
I really need to run out too now, but Elise, thank you so much. That was really great. You brought up so many important issues. So
Thank you.
hope to see you when you're back on this
Yeah.
side. Good
Yeah,
luck with everything. And
yeah, you too.
Thanks, Carolyn. Have a great day. Hey, Kariuki, nice to see your face.
Yeah, that was really insightful. I just kept on thinking about some of the work I've been doing in Kenya, and I couldn't really, find a way to contribute. So that's why I remained silent. But yeah, I think one of the thoughts that finally came to mind was like working with grassroots activists, how I think I've found it to be the case that I learn a lot from them, because most, organizing takes a lot of time, and by the time you find people who are already like doing, activist work, it means they've done work before we got there, and the experiences kind of really shed insights into ways of, dealing, whether it's the state, sometimes it's not even the state, sometimes it's other competing groups within the same areas. So yeah, I mean, it's a question I'm also still like trying to think about, because some of the partners I've been working with have talked about like, trying to speak the language of the state, so that you can find a way to maneuver those moments when, the state could be against you, and then, you kind of frame it as, lawful kind of activist work or protesting, and kind of using the master sues against the master. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of like being able to play both sides of the coin, and being able to maybe, I like to say, like weaponizing our privilege, or like weaponizing our platforms as academics or as people in the with maybe that certain manipulation of language, or like even resources that we have and like privileges that we have to maybe get out of some tricky situations, or further help the people that we're working with, which I haven't really had the opportunity to do yet, but I think that's quite important. It's interesting to get to kind of be in that interplay of both those realms. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes I encounter also just like multiple realms, say part of the work, you know, especially in conflict resolution kind of aspects of conflicts, to be, I mean, let's face it, an ally to some extent of reindeer herders, let's say, on the ground, but also wanting to learn with conservation actors such as park rangers, and kind of navigating the trickiness of not only not wanting to divulge information I shouldn't, but also just the mere act of speaking with a national park ranger. I remember I was really, some folks that I was staying with were somewhat unhappy but mostly just worried after my long conversation with some park rangers, because, you know, they said, don't tell them anything, don't tell them anything. Like once I went to get water, they just whispered, so serious, don't say anything. So I don't say anything, but like, how do I know what could perhaps be a dangerous thing to say? And also there was an important moment for me where, you know, so my lack of expertise in GPS technology, but my decent ability to just figure out how to use a techno gizmo was a source of, still is a source of kind of concern for me, just in the sense where I wanted to ask questions to a national park ranger, and I ended up learning a lot of important things that I think could even help the cause of the reindeer herders, but also just help bring more nuance to the whole thing as well, and a broader understanding. Yet before he would answer my questions, he kept saying, I've got this GPS, how do I use it? How do I know what the kilometer distance between here and here is? And I figured, okay, there's probably not that much damage that can be done by teaching someone how to measure a distance on a GPS. But I did teach him how to measure a distance. And that's still a moment that comes back to me as very low level of danger, but just as a reminder that it's a really tricky thing to be balancing this. But of course, you know, I guess that gives me more insight into how, you know, the people with whom I'm learning on the ground are faced with such trickiness in a daily way, just of course in a different manner. Yeah, there's the multiple sides of these issues are kind of interesting. And just another thought of when I've been writing about things, I've started painstakingly, you know, when there's word counts and word limits, you have to be concise, but I don't know how many times in this article I just published, I don't know how many times I wrote allegedly, as well as reportedly, and according to hearsay, you know, and it, you know, it's experimental. I don't know if it's really, because who knows, maybe someone in a court of law, you could be like, well, obviously we interpret this person, but I said allegedly, reportedly, hearsay, my own experience, my own ethnographic experiences. Sometimes I say, according to hearsay, an anthropologist, ellipsis. And so speaking of my own experiences as hearsay has been kind of interesting, but we kind of have to find ways of, you know, of saying the truth without harming, you know. But I mean, you walk in the woods and you step on bugs, so I don't know, it's kind of impossible. But yeah, nice shirt, Kariuki.
Thank you.
And you too, Louise. You're on mute. You're on mute, Louise.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I have a quick question. So when you reported your burnout, who noticed it first? Was it you? You told me some of your peers noticed, maybe your profs noticed. And how did was there a system for your profs to support you?
Whoa, asking the real questions. Okay. See, my profs aren't here right now, so that's
They could watch it online. By the way, would you like to keep recording? We can stop recording or keep recording. It's up to
whatever.
you.
Who saw the burnout first? I don't think I realized that I was in burnout. I feel like burnouts, you don't really realize that you're burning out until like after you reached a point where like you're like very bad. And also when people start saying, like, I had like a week where every day someone was like, wow, you look really tired. You seem really tired. And I was like, whoa, this is a bit much. And just being, I think I was noticing that I was at my wit's end with a lot of things. I was very impatient. I'd go to meetings and I had like 3 meetings in a row and I was so impatient and I was quite unpleasant to be around, which is somewhat out of character, I would like to think. So I was very short with people. I just wanted to like, I just didn't want to be there. I wasn't contributing anything like actually of importance, probably. I was just there and I was miserable. And I noticed that because I didn't always feel like that, obviously. Otherwise, why would I do this? I was always miserable. But I think it was some of my activist peers, my like close friends who had themselves experienced burnout to a degree, who started kind of pulling me aside and being like, hey, like you need to take a step back. And I was like, I can't right now because we got this action, we got this other action, and I'm helping to coordinate. And I if I step back, like, and of course, like a lot of these things go ahead without you, but also sometimes they don't. And so you feel like the whole weight is on your shoulders. And if you step away, then you're disappointing people, whatever it is. So I didn't feel like I could step back, and I knew that I had to, but I couldn't. And so I had some people eventually even saying like, you're starting to resent us, you're starting to resent the movement. And if you keep going like this, like, you know, you won't come back, essentially. You keep kind of saying like, it'll be fine, you know, next week it'll be fine. Once the meeting's over, it'll be fine. But it just isn't, because you don't give yourself any time to actually recharge. It's just nonstop. And when you're home, you're thinking about it. When you're on campus, you're thinking about it. You get to this place and you're thinking about it. It's just nonstop. So that's not the question. Yeah, my activist peers notice it first because they're more familiar with it. My supervisors didn't notice it because I don't see them much. Like we've obviously been up until now been meeting only online and only once a month. So the last time I had met with them, you know, again, over a 1-hour meeting on, you know, Microsoft Teams or whatever, like you don't see everything else that's going on in the background. And so they know, but I also like I don't know, like I was a bit apprehensive about, you know, going over and being like, I'm burning out, I'm having a really hard time. Because it's also this thing in this, you know, the academic realm that and again, people have different experiences, but there is a power dynamic with your supervisors. And there are certain, I don't know, like,
I guess my question is, you seem to say earlier that there's quite a significant percentage of students who experience that, right? And you know some. So what's in place in the university? Like, what is the support system? There has to be something. It makes no sense. In any workplace, there's always a employee assistance program, you know, so why not the university?
That's kind of my critique, right? Saying that, and of course there is always stuff, you know, there's like, you know, they might send an email once a month and they'll be like, your mental health is important to us. Like, you can go to student services and request an appointment or whatever, like, you know, drink more water. Like, I don't know, like one day a year where they're like, mental health matters, you know, but it's not actually ingrained in the practices. It's not ingrained in the practices of developing research designs. That's what my critique is. I think the university, to an extent, has to offer some services for support, not in the sense, but that's more generalized. They don't actually attack the fact that being a researcher in a lot of these fields does like contribute to or exacerbate and like mutually grows along with imposter syndrome. and women are more affected by it typically because of the patriarchy and things. But I mean, a lot of postgrads are affected by it because you're constantly in this extreme hyper competitive field where, you know, people are calling you an expert and you're like, I'm not an expert. I have to read everything ever on a topic and I still feel really uncomfortable about it. I can never be an expert.
So did your profs apart from saying go to the student assistance program or whatever, did they give you any advice? Did they help you out?
They've said that I should talk to them.
And you did speak to them?
Yes.
Okay, so they did give you some kind of indirect support.
But my critique with this is that often it's reactive rather than proactive.
Right. Yeah.
And that so once students have already experienced burnout and are actually like have already like succumbed to the consequences emotionally of burnout, and it's affecting them emotionally and like maybe in their work and in their personal life and whatnot, then people start to notice, and then people are like, okay, let's deal with this. Maybe let's try to reduce the chances of it happening again. But there isn't really a conversation about academic burnout from the onset of starting a master's or a PhD. There isn't really a talk about burnout and how it may progress and like the signs of burnout as you kind of delve into the project, and how maybe a project could even make you more susceptible to imposter syndrome and burnout and emotional tensions and all of these other, you know, these issues that like I face and that many people face to different degrees. You don't talk about that in the research design. You talk about, you know, what are the questions, what are the objectives, how feasible is the project, but not like how feasible is my mental health to survive through this process, because you're disposable. Like, we're in a corporate structure. Like, this is a business. They're just pumping us out. Don't care if you have imposter.
Well, I guess have you learned for two things? Have you learned more about since your burnout, and also have you learned things about your arrest? Have those two sort of not traumatic events, but those two events helped you as a researcher?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think they've contributed to my understanding and contributed to my experiences, and they've provided me with valuable life lessons.
Yes, that's good. Well, that's, you know, sometimes we have to go through difficult times and it makes us a better person, right?
And also, I mean, I don't really like this, but in a sense, again, like you would be in any kind of, you know, group or community, these experiences are so common. It's also part of, like, in a way, like, you know, a rite of passage, like for you to experience arrest and burnout is like, wow, classic activist thing. It kind of earns you a little bit of social cred in a way. Like if I wasn't a genuinely dedicated activist, and if I was just a self-involved, self-interested researcher, which people could still argue that I am, that's fine. Then would I have genuinely experienced these trademark, like, I don't know, experiences or checkpoints that most activists in my environment have also experienced? It gives me a ground from which to relate with them.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't want it to be social capital. It's more of just maybe a point of relatability. But they are like rites of passage in a way.
Yeah.
You know, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. I had thoughts and then they just flew away. Kind of nice for a moment. But yeah, real interesting in terms of the proactive. Oh, by the way, we're 4 minutes past 7:30,
Okay.
which is the end time, in case you have to skedaddle to your event. Yeah, it's a real interesting kind of. I actually hadn't thought about you know, the potential proactivity for helping students do burnout or other kind of similar things, or perhaps correlated things. There is, of course, probably, you know, I'm sure in our kind of in orientation, which I somehow I'm now doing my PhD. I've gone to 3 different universities haven't had a single orientation, but I imagine they give you resources from the free, we're bombarded with announcements of resources. And yet, I don't know about you, but for me, it's okay, nice to know, but it hasn't really, helped prepare for anything. But also, I think, and I don't want to say that we can't be proactive. I'm sure we can. Sometimes these things are very difficult to kind of anticipate, but perhaps that's with a lack of proactivity to avoid those things. But yeah, I do believe that oftentimes, for some folks at least, once you would be in a position, okay, now I'll reach out to someone or whatever. Of course, the emotional consequences have had a toll and on your work, and that can be and then reaching out can actually be added labor that takes more time, and so you start doing that, but then you don't have the time to do your other things. And of course, there is, I believe, but I haven't looked in, there is of course sometimes an option of, okay, well, if you're being funded by the government, let's say with Shirk, okay, well, you can take medical leave, okay, well, to take medical leave, I believe you'll now have to have a written document, that says what your problem is. And, if you reach out to the sources, you get, like, I'm speaking for myself. I, for one, for years have been quite wary of mental health infrastructure, let alone within a business such as university. So it can be, it cannot be the kind of, the resources that are offered, unfortunately, I think, are not necessarily always the answer for students who might benefit from it. But I think talking about it with folks is probably a good idea. So thanks, Elise, for bringing it up.
Well done.
Bravo.
Thank you.